Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today we're going over how to set up and use new UniFi zone-based firewall rules, and they're awesome. It is a phenomenal update to anybody who's using the old firewall rules, and I've now migrated everybody on over to them, and they just work so much better. Not only do you have far greater control over exactly what routes are allowed to be taken and where the rules are applied, but they also give you the ability to just set them up in a much simpler and much more intuitive manner. You can see exactly what zone everything is in and really see which rules are being applied at a much higher level. I think it's going to make people not only be able to set up rules that are much more complex and therefore much more secure for their exact setup, but it's also going to give people the ability to just understand and use the firewall more in a way that I think has been great. It also works at the interface level now, which is really important. Previously, there was no easy way of just creating a general block all, and because it was not interface based, you didn't have the ability to actually set it on an interface level, it just had to be on an IP level. Now, the zones are actually being handled on an interface level, which is really important for more complex deployments. And it just has really easy ways to say exactly what's going on. So if you've not updated already, you can go ahead and do it. And I've already done it on this machine. I've shown that in other videos. Basically, it takes in and migrates your old firewall rules as best as possible. You can see it's still giving me the ability, if I want to roll back to that old setup should I need to for any reason. And now this is where these zones really work. It's pretty straightforward. And we can see that there's 3 different sections here. One is our zone versus our network interface. So every single network is now assigned to a zone. And when I'm going to be using the word network and the word interface pretty much interchangeably here. They're technically different, but it's easy enough of a simplification here. So if you look, these are the default ones that come right out of the box, but we can also create our own as well. So we can see that we have 3 zones that we're able to control: internal, hotspot, DMZ, and 3 zones with this little lock right here that we are not allowed to control. And that's because these are actually kind of hooked up and locked in, and they are ones that the router actually uses. So we can't make something a VPN that's not a VPN because it's got its own rules in there. So that's our first section. This is where we control exactly where everything is and can also create those additional zones. Then the way the zones take place is actually in this matrix right here, which is why it's called these zone-based firewalls. And we can see on the left-hand side is our source. Our source means where we started. So if we started on the internal network, we can see that if we go to the internal network for destination, we're allowed, external allowed. Basically, we're saying that our internal network is pretty much allowed to send traffic anywhere. And that's pretty reasonable for most people. This is basically your most secure network, is kind of how they're setting this up by default. Essentially, we're saying that this is allowed to everything. And we can also come in here and get more granular rules on all this stuff if we need to. So essentially the way it comes out of the box is your internal network, anything you add in these zones, you're essentially going to trust. Then the next default is hotspot. Anything you put in here will be considered a guest network. And as you can see, hotspot has no access to even itself. So the hotspot going to the hotspot will be blocked. What that means is devices on the hotspot cannot talk to each other. They're isolated. But devices on the hotspot are allowed to go out to the internet. And the internal network is allowed to talk to the hotspots. And so the hotspots are now allowed to return. So that's how they're set up there. By the way, anything you add in this hotspot right here, it'll actually go ahead and basically enable itself as a landing portal. So be careful on that. I'm not a huge fan of landing portals for small businesses and home users, so I generally don't enable that. But if you do, that will be running like that. And finally, you have your DMZ. DMZ is a very common term in networking, and it is essentially the middle ground between your internal network and the internet. So let's say you're running a web server that obviously needs to be able to serve web pages to the internet. But now that is on the internet. There's internet access to that thing. If it gets compromised, you don't really want it to be able to do anything except the very specific things it needs access to. And so what you'll do is you'll create a DMZ network. And what that is basically, it is a thing that the internet is allowed to hit. So port 80 and 443 for a web server. And maybe you write a couple of rules to say, hey, the DMZ is allowed to hit this internal database server because you've got a MySQL server running on your internal network. And yeah, it needs to be able to hit that. And so you can write a specific rule for that. And you can also say that your internal network is allowed to talk to the DMZ, and the DMZ is allowed to reply. So those are the kinds of things you'll do with this. So that is how this matrix works, and those are our basic zones. And finally, when we select any one of these, we can see that these are all the rules that are being applied at that level. And so this is how you use the grid, and it's really useful. So what we can do is we can reorder and also just create new policies right here and see everything we've got. And let's start actually kind of deploying this for this base network configuration that I've got here. So we can see the 3 VLANs I've got right here. And I think I'm going to actually add one additional one right here, and we're going to call it servers. And you can see anytime I'm creating a new VLAN, I actually get to choose exactly what zone it is in. And I'm going to call it /20. So basically servers are going to be our ultra protected stuff. And that's really what we're going to focus on the most. All right, so now we've got ourselves a pretty common setup. So we've got our office, which we're just going to basically have it be all of the normal computers in there, our servers, and our cameras. And finally, I'm going to go ahead and I'll add one more and we'll call it guest. And guest, we could put in that hotspot. If we put in hotspot, it will automatically have a landing portal in there, which I'm not a huge fan of. So we're actually just going to leave it in internal, create it really quick. We're not going to add in the isolate network right here. We're going to do that all through here. Okay, so I think this is now a good number of VLANs to show all the firewall rules you might want to create and how you would create zones for them. So now if we come into our firewall rules, we can see that by default, because I haven't changed anything, every single one of these is basically treated as trusted internal. And so you can see internal is allowed to anything, which we definitely do not want. Instead, we're going to start writing some more specific rules and kind of setting this up in the way that we want to. And so there is a whole lot of ways that we can handle this and do exactly whatever we want to. But I'm just going to give one basic setup that I would do for this. So what we're going to essentially say is that the cameras in the guest network, we don't really want them talking to anything other than themselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a zone, and we can just call it something like untrusted or isolated, however we really want to do it. We'll call it untrusted. And so we're essentially just going to say our cameras cannot be trusted. Maybe we got ones that we don't think have the best firmware on them. Maybe there's also just external runs to the building that you want to assume that somebody can not plug a cable into and get into your network. So we're going to set that our guests and our cameras are both on this untrusted zone that we're about to create here. Great. So now we've got a much better setup here. We can see that it has by default said that our untrusted network is allowed to not access anything on the internal network, makes sense to me, is allowed to go to the internet and talk to the gateway to be able to go in and do the basics here. So all fine, but it can't access the VPN, hotspot, DMZ, or untrusted. That all are great right out of the box firewall rules. That's just how easy it is. And if you wanted something more customized, you could do that. You could actually say right here, hey, all the cameras are actually going to be recording footage to a very specific part of the NAS. So let's say you've got your NAS and you actually just want all the cameras to be able to record footage to it. Well, let's go ahead and say that the internal network on servers, so we're going to say that the servers, which is in the internal zone, on the actual even device level if you wanted to select it, but we'll just do the network level. So we're going to say that the servers are allowed with auto return traffic means that the cameras will be able to reply to go into the untrusted cameras network. And if you wanted to, you could even restrict it to only a destination port range that maybe the security cameras were using. Really, you can go as granular as you want with this kind of stuff, but I think this is a great place to start. So what we've got is essentially the servers, and once again, we could also just choose a specific device or an IP address. So maybe our NAS is at 128.5.5, and we're going to say, it can access the cameras however it wants to. And it's allowed to go in, and the traffic is allowed. And we've also ticked this box that means when the cameras get the request from the server, they're allowed to reply to that. If you did not check this box, basically the NAS could talk to the cameras, but the cameras couldn't say anything in response at all. So you would not be very useful. Once again, we could also go in and check the exact ports used by this to be really specific. And you can say, hey, it only needs, in this case, it probably just needs HTTP port 80 as a lot of cameras get operating on them. So we just do 80. And you can literally say exactly what you want to be able to do. So what I've got here is I've got a very specific server that I'm going to say that it is allowed to reach out to the camera VLAN. And if it's on port 80, it will be allowed. And when the cameras get it, it'll be returned back. And so they can reply and we'll log it. And just like that, we can write this very simple firewall rule that shows us, hey, we are allowed to do really specific things. And that is the power of these zone-based firewall rules. So this is how you're pretty much writing all of these firewall rules. Because they're at this broad zone level, it's much easier to really get specific with it and say exactly what can and cannot happen and really write out the rules. So you can see because I added that allow return traffic, when the untrusted network is going to the internal network, it's going to first check and see, hey, is this a return traffic from the server going to port 80? If so, allow it. And that's how these zone-based firewall rules work. We can get further and further granular on exactly what we'd like them to be able to do. And so now maybe we say that we don't want all internal network to be able to go to everything, right? Instead, maybe we want to restrict it down a little bit. So let's say we don't really want our office network to being able to just have full blatant access to the servers, right? We kind of want to isolate those on out, and we're only going to allow the things that we want in there. Well, we're just going to go into our internal to internal and just create a rule that says block office to servers. So we're going to say that if the source zone is internal on the network of office, going into the network of servers, we're going to go ahead and block it and log it. So we're going to go ahead and add this to the end of our list because the way firewall rules work is you start at the top, keep going down until you match, and then you apply whatever you do there. So in this case, right now, there's no exception to this rule. So any traffic that originates on the office network will not be able to talk to the servers, which is pretty limiting because now we can't use our servers for anything. But now let's say we've got a ton of very common file servers. So we're going to go ahead and say, I'm just going to trust anybody who's trying to use one of these as a file server, a web server, and another thing. So now we can say, all right, Office, if you're using these specific ports, you're allowed in, right? So we're going to look up and see what the ports are for the services that we're using. And if we want to, we can just say the entire network, or we can once again say super granular where we can do it device by device. For most security things, it's probably sufficient to just allow your broad protocols of HTTP, SMB, other things that your office probably will need access to, like DNS if you're running Active Directory, whatever. So really for most people, you don't need to go device by device by device and say exactly what everything's allowed access to. but you absolutely can. And especially if you've got something special, like maybe everybody needs access to a SFTP server running on port 22. Maybe you only say, hey, everybody gets access to that port 22. And then you also say your IT group have access to all things on port 22. Once again, you're really able to customize these rules however you want to. So now we're going to go ahead and create that policy, and we're just going to do some broad things here. We're going to say allow office to common services. So we're going to just kind of keep it really simple and say, hey, if it's using a service that is pretty normal, web, SMB, those kinds of things, we'll allow them. So we're going to write our same rule here. Our source zone is going to be the office. Our destination zone is going to be the servers. We're going to allow this one. We're going to allow the return traffic. And really quick thing to do here, when we're setting our port, you almost never set the source port. Source port is variable. It does not guarantee that it's going to be coming from a specific source. And if you're using NAT, it'll actually rewrite the source port anyway. So there's very rarely ever any reason to run off of a source port of X, Y, or Z, except for maybe mail servers, which do need it. But other than that, very rarely ever set your source port. Instead, have your source port be any and your destination port be specific. And once again, we could actually create custom objects right here for this. So we'll say these are all going to be our trusted services. So these are all the services that every time we spin up a new server, we're going to assume the office is allowed to do it. We'll just call it trusted services. And this is where you look up every service you're using. So we'll go ahead and I'm just going to add some custom ones and regular ones on here. 80, which is going to be HTTP. 443, which is HTTPS. 445, which is SMB. 43, which is DNS. And that's, we'll leave it at that. So basically, this will cover our web services, our file servers, and a DNS server. You really do this on whatever network setup you've got. I basically have rules that allow all my servers and pretty much everything to hit my Zabbix port because I pretty much want all my devices contacting and sending data to Zabbix. So you really write this however you want to. And in general, writing something like this, while it does technically say that now anybody on the office can contact any server and ask for the web port, if you're in an ultra secure level, you'll actually say exactly who is allowed to do what. But for 99% of offices, this is more than secure. And in general, when I'm recommending setups for security, the best security setup is the one you actually implement. A lot of people will go and think they have to do everything down to the perfect T, and they end up just not doing it. And so that's why doing these things is totally fine to do. But now we've got our list of common trusted services that we're going to say, you know, we probably are going to trust all of these things. And maybe we've got one specific server where we don't want that to be true. We can write firewall rules that restrict it out as well. But now we've got our object, we've pretty much got our rules. We can see that we are going to allow the office to the servers with return traffic on these trusted ports. And if we want to, we can even log it. But now we've made a grave error right here. This rule is useless because firewall rules start at the top and go down to the bottom. So right now, this is not going to do anything because first, everything's going to be blocked by this. So it's important to remember the order of the rules that you're setting because we want to make sure that we're allowing this at the top. So basically, it first checks the allowed ports and then blocks everything else, rather than first blocking everything else and then checking the ports, but it would never get there. And so actually, this order itself is not actually sufficient. If you look, this return rule that was automatically created did not actually get hit because this will have hit that return traffic first. So one thing we actually need to do here is change that block. We need to make sure to set it to the connection status of new or invalid. That way, established and related traffic falls through, and so replies will fall through it. As you can see, there's a ton of stuff you can do here, but this is pretty much how you set these things on up and really look at what kind of rules you've got. There's tons and tons of customization you can do this, and what I generally recommend people do is think about, hey, what's the bare requirements for everything to communicate? What is required? And for regular home users, even small businesses, this is probably overkill. But for organizations who have a lot of services and want their servers to kind of be protected from their own users, having these firewall rules is a huge first step because it just keeps people from being able to exploit vulnerabilities by just never being able to even contact the server itself. That's not to say you should have insecure things, but this is a huge step in making sure that there's just a lower threat surface. Even if one of your office computers gets a virus, it's not going to be able to exploit any RDP vulnerabilities because RDP is blocked and things like that. And this, as you can see, is way easier than it ever was when we were working with the old UniFi firewall rules. It's just so intuitive and you can see all the rules exactly as they were created. And I think it makes it really easy to tell what's going on and debug. Well, that's going to be it for this tutorial. If you have any other questions, put those down in the comments below. And if you want to hire me, there's a link for that down in the description below. And have a good one. Bye.